What happens if we lose that dynamic, that productive dynamic that ensures that a field can move forward into new territory sustainably without causing unnecessary damage? I worry about that dynamic, and it's concerning to hear that that's going on in medical school. It's not surprising based on what I've witnessed the outcomes of that being, but you're getting this firsthand view of it.
Yeah. And again, I come into this, I mean, there's been so many things throughout the years that I've been wrong on. And I come into this knowing that I could be wrong on a lot of these things. And I welcome those other perspectives, but uh, we can't have any of those discussions. And for example, in one of the lectures that we had on gender affirming care and obtaining a social history and the use of pronouns. Um, so we were discussing gender affirming care for adolescents. And I had mentioned that I was having a really hard, because this lecture came just a week after, or a couple of weeks after we had learned about eating disorders. And I had mentioned that I'm actually having a really hard time under, understanding the finer distinctions between body dysmorphia and gender dysphoria. Because if you take out like the specific words of like gender versus body, the definitions are essentially exactly the same. That it's a person who doesn't feel comfortable in the way that they look or the way that people perceive them, and they want to change something about their physical appearance in order to better match their outsides. And, uh, I wanted to ask about like what are possibly the downstream negative effects of that, of just immediately pushing gender affirmation, when this sort of distinction, that when I can't quite see a distinction between them just wanting to appear a different way, which, my goodness, like being a young woman, like growing up, I know exactly what that means. It's awful. It's awful when your outside doesn't match your inside. And you are not as skinny or beautiful or clear skinned, or bright and sunny, or silky smooth hair as the person that you want to be. I understand what that feels like, and I'm having a hard time understanding how to distinguish that from this gender dysphoria that that we're saying is incredibly valid, and the way to overcome that is through affirming the person's gender. And I it went not only did it go nowhere, but that line of questioning is transphobic, and it wasn't, let's figure out how to properly distinguish that, because we don't want to accidentally um, affirm somebody who dislikes their body because other people are nasty to them, or other people are telling them that they're not worthy. People say some horrible things to little girls, or young boys, that, and we never got that discussion. And in another example, kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum, there's no focus on anybody else outside of the transgender community who might be, I don't like saying the word harmed, because I think that that's also an overused term, but one of the discussions that we had was the importance of the use of pronouns, and why you always ask people it 100% of the time at the beginning of every single encounter. You always ask their pronouns, no matter how much you think that their sexual identity aligns with their gender identity. And it kind of those universal precautions. And I had mentioned that there might be some room for discretion on this because having been in the military, but also having worked with a lot of these like elderly veteran gentlemen where someone where we could walk into a room with someone and assume their gender and say, "Hi, ma'am, how are you doing today?" And they say, I actually go by he, him." On the other side of the token, we might be walking into a room with a 65-year-old, 40-year veteran of the military and say, "Hello, so and so, what gender pronouns do you prefer?" And they could say, "What are you talking about? Obviously, I'm a man. Like, am I giving the wrong impression?" And they could be offended by that, and it could offend their masculinity. And when bringing up that point, it devolved into, well, this is, that's, white supremacist, cisgender normative, and that they are just going to have to deal with it, which is really concerning.
And this is an audio only episode. So, people, if anybody's watching on YouTube, they can't see me face palming. Um, so you brought up two important points, and I'm sure you have many more, but I want to pause to respond. So you were talking about the difference between gender affirmation and body dysmorphia in adolescence, and then you were talking about this new standard that you always ask people their pronouns 100% of the time, which sounds incredibly annoying and virtue signaling and culturally incompetent with so many people. I mean, it's interesting that the same people oftentimes who are so big on these practices, they claim to care about cultural diversity. And they claim, as you're saying, that to challenge the idea that you should always ask someone their pronouns is this white supremacist, of course, they like to label things white supremacists and so on, as if this is a normal standard in non-white, non-Western countries. That couldn't be further from the truth. I mean, I feel like it would break these people's minds open to see how relatively conservative many other cultures are, including many non-white, non-Western cultures, when it comes to um, understanding the reality of biological sex and respecting that. So yeah, it's like this sort of like gender uber alles thing, right? That pandering to this particular population has to take precedence over so many other things, including sensitivity to the needs of different populations, including having natural interactions with, honestly, the vast majority of people who don't want to play this game. Um, and and I can imagine it could be confusing for people for whom, they're new to this culture or English is not their first language. Um, and then what to speak of how that compromises trauma-informed care for detransitioners. So in my work with detransitioners, um, many of them maybe had complex trauma before they transed and detransed. That might have been part of what drove them into it. But even if they didn't have complex trauma before they went through it, now they have complex trauma from going through all of that, both medically, physically, and mentally, emotionally. And some of the trauma that they experience is sort of emerging from this haze of thinking they were trans, realizing that it was all actually something else and that this is just making them feel worse, coming to terms with the shock and pain of kind of where they're finding their bodies, oftentimes very, very young in life, and finding that they're suffering at a level of unwellness that many people don't experience until later in life. And then not being able to get away from constant reminders of their trauma, because some detransitioners emerge from this saying, I feel like I was in a cult. I feel like I was in a body modification cult and I sacrificed everything um, to to a group that's brainwashed and that never had my best interest at heart. Many detransitioners report saying that. And so to emerge from that into this world where they cannot get away from constant reminders of that cult that they feel like they were in that personally harmed them, that harmed their bodies, um, can make them feel crazy. It can make them feel on the edge of despair, and it can cause them to not get the help that they need. I've heard this. I mean, detransitioners need far more medical care and psychiatric care, ideally, than the average, age matched person, right? But who can blame them for not wanting to set foot in a medical setting when A, medical settings are where this all happened, and then B, in a medical setting, they have to constantly be reminded that everyone in the medical system still believes in this stuff. And then then if they can jump through those hoops, if they can get past the constant trauma reminders that are sort of reactivating their PTSD symptoms by being asked what their pronouns are everywhere they go, if they can get past that, then people don't know how to help them. And the care that they need often isn't covered by insurance. And there's not even ICD codes for detransition. So it all just gets coded as more gender affirming care in the system. So then we don't have the statistics on detransition. I mean, at this point, I'm tying in a bunch of different issues, but there's a major lack of cultural competency in these practices, and it strikes me as blissfully unaware and so incredibly misguided to hear that your peers in medical school really think that asking 100% of people what their pronouns are 100% of the time is actually a culturally competent maneuver when it's clearly not, and thinking that nobody's harmed in the process. I know your caution around the word harm is justified because it is overused, but when you think about how this affects detransitioners, like I've just heard from so many of them that wish they could get away from it, that wish they could just go to sleep for 100 years and wake up when it's all over, wake up when nobody's asking anybody their pronouns anymore, and we're just back to before this all began, as a culture, right? And who knows where we're headed, but it seems so awkward.